Hello, everyone. Welcome to Her Wealthy Show, your show. And today we have Rachel Doern. She's a leader in entrepreneurship and she's been working with entrepreneurs since many years, not only to implement, but also to scale. So before we start, maybe you can say a few words about yourself. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, so I'm an academic primarily. I also do some consultancy work and some coaching. I work at Goldsmiths University of London in the United Kingdom, and my research and teaching relates to entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship and how entrepreneurs navigate difficult situations, contexts, and emotions. So, crisis management and resilience, these topics underpin a lot of the work that I do. But I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you for trusting me in these first episodes. And I always like to start this podcast with the idea that we go back into the memories that we have around money. So, briefly, if you could tell us before we go into entrepreneurship and all the topics that we have for today, what's your first memory around money? And do you think that, that first memory that you became aware, how does it resonate also with financial responsibility?
One of my earliest memories around money traces back to when I was about 5 or 6 years old. So I'm originally from Canada. And I remember distinctly putting things in my red wagon. I know it sounds really cliched, but I did have one, putting old books and magazines and toys and pulling my wagon down the street, down my road, and knocking on the doors of neighbors in the hopes that they would buy some of my old things so I could earn a little bit of money. And I think I was met by a lot of smiles and amusement and occasionally some milk and cookies. I was on my own, so it was a very different time. It felt quite safe. And and I remember having fun with it and feeling rewarded by it. And then maybe even a year or two later, it was my cousin's birthday. She's slightly younger than me, and wanting to buy her a silver watch, not real silver, of course, but wanting to buy her a watch and doing something similar, setting up a table in my front, we would call garden. We would call yard and they would call garden here in the UK, and trying to sell some of my toys once again so I could earn enough money to buy her this watch. And I did. And I felt really proud of myself. And it turned her wrist green because it wasn't real, of course. But she was delighted, and so was I. And so I remember thinking and learning at that young age that money was a means to an end. Money was a form of autonomy and freedom, and it could help me figure out how to solve problems and do the kinds of things that I wanted to do.
Wow, I love the story. So
Thank
you
you.
were an entrepreneur before you became an
Absolutely.
entrepreneur.
Certainly interested in entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship always.
Yeah, it came to that memory. And do you think it shaped also how you saw risk differently in when you became professionally independent?
I think so. I think I see risk and ambiguity as a challenge, as something to work through, as an opportunity to create my own structure and path and come up with solutions. So I think I am quite solution oriented. And I think probably a lot of it does come from those early years as well, and seeing that you can try different things and maybe it won't always work, but there is a solution to be reached.
Yeah, and I will link that to our next topic around entrepreneurship. So we're going deep dive into what do you think or what originally drew you to study entrepreneurship and crisis related to entrepreneurship?
Yeah, so I've been working with entrepreneurs, researching entrepreneurs for over 20 years now, so quite some time. And my interest in crises and crisis management and resilience can be traced back to three events. So the first event was back in the noughties, so the early 2000s, when I was carrying out my PhD research. And my PhD was looking at entrepreneurs in emerging and transition market economies, especially SMEs, and how they were dealing with certain barriers, managing or overcoming them. And in places like Russia, for instance, where institutions were quite underdeveloped at the time, so legal, regulatory, and financial in nature, it was quite common for those small businesses to face numerous inspections on their businesses from state regulators, sometimes more than 30 a year. And the sole purpose was to extort money from them. So it was a very difficult, very hostile environment for small businesses. But yet they managed at the same time to persist, to carry on, even though they faced these chronic attacks, as I like to think of it, on their businesses. That was the first instance where I thought, this is what a challenging context in which they're dealing with, but yet they're managing somehow to carry on. The second instance was when I was living in North London in an area called Wood Green. And in the summer of 2011, in August, on August 4th, a young Black man, a 29-year-old Black man by the name of Mark Duggan, was shot and killed by police. And that instigated a couple of days later a full-blown riot situation, which started as a peaceful protest outside of the main police station in Tottenham when people were demanding to speak to a senior police officer, trying to understand what happened. How could this have occurred? But because of social media and other things, the crowd grew. People came from outlying areas. And what started as a peaceful protest escalated, and people started to taunt the police, throw things at police vehicles, and set a police car on fire. And the police dispersed the crowd. The crowd began running up and down the high street, so where a number of shops were. And then they started to smash up, loot, and vandalize, and sometimes burn down shops along the way, and some residences as well. And then the riots spread to my area where I was living at the time, Wood Green, and to other parts of London. In fact, at the time, I think 22 of the 32 boroughs in London were affected over the next 4 days, and it spread to other parts of the UK, of England in particular as well. So a couple of months after that event, I went out and I spoke to different small businesses in different boroughs affected as to what they made of the riots, why they felt it occurred, how they felt about the police response, because sometimes there were only 7 or 8 riot officers contending with hundreds of rioters, what they were doing to recover their businesses, how they felt about the support, and how they felt personally, and their ability to be resilient. So that was the second instance, but it was more of an acute attack, a one-off attack, as opposed to the previous example. And then thirdly, like a lot of people, I became interested in the COVID-19 crisis. We all lived through that. And a few days before the first lockdown, so we knew it was coming, there were 3 in the United Kingdom. A few days before the first lockdown, I assembled a group of entrepreneurs and asked them if it would be okay to trace their experiences over the next little while. And I did a diary study. So once a week, every week, or at least once every couple of weeks, I communicated with them, I connected with them via email and asked them what they were doing, how they were doing, how they were thinking and feeling about events, what they were doing to recover. And that happened over a 15-month period, all the way through to after the third lockdown. So over time, I've thought about entrepreneurs and how they manage crises and the different strategies that they utilize, many of which I depict in my book, The Resilient Entrepreneur: From Crisis to Enlightenment, which came out just a few months ago.
Wow, what can I say? After that, I was thinking there are 3 things that I get from your story. You are curious and passionate about getting stories, like
Yes.
with research. So there's the second that I was thinking, like you really like to go deep and understand what really happens.
Yes.
You want to bring some hope and then not only get into the research, but to bring a solution. And that shows what you did through the COVID times. And I was also thinking that now that we talk a lot about technology or deep tech or a number of businesses, I believe that you were also like targeting the really small and medium-sized enterprises, right? So the
Yes.
very and that sometimes I know from my work that they feel overlooked, and also from my personal experience because my parents had businesses. Yeah, I love the idea that you went deep into that and understanding this context, not to bring these solutions. And talking about the solutions and the book you've written, I guess all these experiences brought you to write the book, and that's how it went about it. But like my question would be, which are the solutions that you wish to solve through your work and through your book?
Yeah, so I think I think the main problem that I was looking at is, yeah, what do we do in these situations? And what can we learn from entrepreneurs who have also had to navigate difficult situations, and in my case, crises? And what I think the book does, or what it achieves, or what I hope it does, is that it provides other entrepreneurs and people in general who are interested in entrepreneurship or who are interested in resilience. It provides us with the resources and the tools to manage, to navigate such crises. And it arms us in particular with those strategies that can strengthen our resilience, as well as those strategies that can serve to protect us from the things that we sometimes do that can compromise our resilience as well. So, resilience ultimately is our ability to resist the ill effects of stress or to recover quickly and relatively easily from a stressful event. So, we often think of it as bouncing back, but sometimes we can further think of it as bouncing forward as well, as having grown, as having developed, as having furthered ourselves or our businesses following a crisis. And as you mentioned, I try to do by or through the lens of real entrepreneurs in crisis, but also by sharing stories of people as well as entrepreneurs navigating crises and being resilient and how they do so from different parts of the world as well. So I think that's important to note.
Yeah, it's always important to compare different geographies and not only
Yes.
geographies, cultures. So that's very relevant. I was thinking, how do you bridge what you have identified through your research, through all these years and writing your book, and the connection? And that I say that I want to speak in this podcast differently than in spreadsheets, and the money stories that we have behind, also related and psychology of money, if you want. So I was thinking that resilience sometimes is somehow connected, yeah, to money, to pressure and uncertainty. How would you see that in relation to what you have identified through these, yeah, crisis experiences?
Yeah, I think one of the things I've noticed, I don't know if this answers your question directly, but that one of the things I've noticed from my research and from spending a lot of time with entrepreneurs over the years is that we all have tools. We all have these tools and resources that can help us navigate difficult situations, but we don't necessarily know it, or we don't always use them, or we don't always use them deliberately. But I think that it's important to further reflect on resilience at the individual level and how it can impact on resilience even at the business level or in relation to our attitudes and our experiences towards money. But maybe just to unpack, would it be helpful if I unpacked what I mean by individual resilience a little bit
Yeah,
more so?
absolutely.
Or yeah, so we can think of resilience at the individual level as being about if something difficult happens, whether it's a crisis like COVID-19, so something big in the greater landscape, or it's something personal that happens to us, like a bereavement or an illness or the loss of a job or the loss of a business, right? When these things happen, it's about our ability to maintain healthy functioning. And what I mean by healthy functioning is in both a physical or physiological and or psychological sense. So in the former case, this terrible thing has happened, but are we still able to eat and sleep and exercise? And from a psychological perspective, are we still able to make decisions and problem solve and think clearly as we do? Are we still able to find purpose and meaning in our work, in our businesses? And as part of that, it's about emotion regulation. It's about being able to elicit positive emotions, which help to subdue or quiet those negative emotions. It's about being able to diminish and process those negative emotions, or even on some occasions, avoid them. And it's about being able to adapt positively and or flexibly to those difficult situations, including those financial challenges that we might face if we lose a loved one, perhaps our partners, and they provide half the household income and we need to work further as a result. We're able to adapt positively by doing that and taking care of our families, but we're also able to adapt in a flexible fashion in that we still experience those negative emotions, that grief, that frustration, possibly even a sense of anger, and we're able to work through it and talk about it to others as well and seek out support. And then I mentioned the notion of bouncing forward as well, which is a part of resilience, but it's not a necessary or sufficient condition of such. So when something difficult happens, there are moments, there are occasions when, regardless of what it might be, we recognize some of the value or even benefits, or we develop personally and or professionally after such a situation.
Yeah, no, we need all of that. And going into what you were saying about money and the financial struggles that we can identify from your research, you've mentioned some of the things, but do you have an idea how does money stress show up in these crisis moments?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and maybe just to preface my answer with just a comment or two, I think it does depend a little bit on the kind of business we're referring to. So you mentioned smaller businesses, especially micro businesses. Sometimes we don't shine a light on them. I happen to be very interested in those businesses specifically, and I think you are as well. So I think it does depend a little bit on how old the business is and the size of the business, because most businesses are small or in fact micro enterprises and have no employees or have very few employees. So the smaller you are, the fewer resources you maybe have to contend with the crisis and money stress. So that's one thing to say, but also it might have to do with the nature of the crisis itself. Is it big? Is it national or global in orientation? Does it happen outside of the business or inside of the business? Is it personal or professional in nature? And how does it impact on the business? And then by virtue of such, the individual managing that business. And I think it's also about our approach to volatility as well. So having said that, so I think it depends a little bit. But what I've noticed is that what money stress can do in a crisis situation is that it can create this kind of obsessive passion and or persistence to keep going at all costs. And I think that has a positive and a negative side. So it can impact on the entrepreneur for better or for worse. So I think for better, in the sense that it does give them the incentive, that money stress can give them the incentive, the motivation to persevere and to react when needed. But at the same time, for worse, in the sense that they sometimes, entrepreneurs sometimes are so concerned about money and staffing and otherwise, and keeping operations afloat, that they neglect themselves. They ignore other kind of signals that are going on. And sometimes, in my experience with the people I've spoken to and worked with over the years, they just collapse. I remember speaking to a small business owner who was impacted by the London riots that I mentioned in 2011. And it was an interesting business. It was a business that made women's formal wear, including bridal wear. So one-off pieces by commission and all customized pieces. And their business was vandalized and looted. And it was very difficult for them to have to remake all of those things that they lost and to replace the fabrics and so on. And they spent 3 months closed and trying to recover. They were very concerned about money. And there were 2 women who ran the business. And one of them said she had never been so ill in her life. So for several weeks, she suffered, and it was really something she attributed to the financial pressure and the could they continue, could they not kinds of questions. Because of that, maybe the second part of my response, or the third part perhaps, is that as a result, I think as entrepreneurs, to manage that money stress, we can start thinking about not only what's happening in the business and what I refer to as the business vitals, but also to ourselves, right? Our own personal vitals. So if you're really ill and you go to hospital, one of the first things that they do is they check your breathing and they check your heart rate, right? So they check our vitals, but we can do the same things with our businesses and ourselves. So from a business perspective, if your operations stop, or if your reserves start to dwindle, or if your staff start exiting the business quickly, if these things start to happen, these are warning signals that something is very wrong within the business, and we need to be attuned to such. But we also need to think about our own personal vitals. Again, going back to what I mentioned before, are we able to eat? Are we able to sleep? Are we able to exercise? Are we thinking clearly? Are we able to problem solve? These are indications that we may be suffering, and we need to step back and intervene and do something about it in order to move to the next stage, to be more resilient. So I think that kind of obsessive passion or obsessive persistence that I notice, it does show up a lot in money stress. And there's a good side to it, but there's also a negative side, and we need to protect ourselves from the latter.
Yeah. And what I also read from what you were saying is that, of course, it would depend on the person and the
Yeah.
mindset and many other things, no? And yeah, I was imagining what are the emotional money patterns that are repeating. Like in these moments when you go really down, it must be a lot of scarcity that is popping up, avoidance. Sometimes if you're into the roller coaster, you cannot avoid, of course. And yeah, what do you think it's in terms of money patterns that you have identified around these situations under financial pressure?
So I think I agree. I think they all show up. Absolutely. I think I've noticed a lot of issues around scarcity and over control for certain. I've worked with entrepreneurs over the years who are very fearful of, from a control perspective, becoming too dependent on, overly reliant on outside forces, whether it be in the form of taking a loan from a bank or it be in terms of sharing equity in their business with an investor. But sometimes, especially when a business is struggling or a business wishes to grow, these things are important. So I noticed in COVID, for example, there were a number of COVID loans that the British government was supplying, and not everyone, some people turned to those loans, but many people were hesitant because they were thinking about not wanting to be beholden to these loans, especially in the recovery phase, and concerned about that. So some people put it off. So I saw some of that avoidance in relation to that as well. So I think, yeah, these things, scarcity in terms of concerns around spending in a crisis, sometimes people shrinking their business development budgets or their marketing spend, but then maybe finding themselves in situations later on in the recovery phase where I was speaking about it with a friend of mine recently who was saying some businesses in COVID, for example, again, lost their momentum as a result and were never able to get back to where they were before because of it. Yeah, so I am noticing some of these emotional money patterns as well.
Yeah, no, I have the impression that we are talking much more about these things nowadays than many years ago. Also, when you were mentioning about burnout of entrepreneurs or business owners, and also around emotionally overwhelmed by money. Do you identify that are any inner skills that you've seen they matter most when there is this financial stress?
Yes. I think there are two things I would say. One is self-awareness. I think that's really important. And then also emotion regulation, as I was alluding to
Yeah.
earlier. Self-awareness is really about understanding how we think and feel about things, what triggers us, but it's also being aware of how other people perceive us at the same time. So there's this internal and this external dimension. So I think self-awareness in terms of understanding our relationship to money, how we think about the presence or absence of such, what sort of triggers us, what might inform our experiences in relation to money, going back to even the question you asked me at the beginning. And understanding as well, maybe when we're making sound financial decisions and why, and at the same time when we're not, and why that might
Mm.
be the case. And this might necessitate a number of things. So it might be that we need to track our experiences, how we're reacting in these situations by journaling, but it also could be thinking about that external dimension of self-awareness. It could be about talking to people who know us, our friends, our family members, but also maybe our business partners, the people that we're working with, to try to help to inform us further as to when we're making certain decisions and why, and when they're good decisions or when we're just being reactive under pressure. So that's a little bit about self-awareness. But I think also emotion regulation is really important, is a skill that we can develop, we can get better at, but it does take place often, not always, but often internally. And maybe just a couple words on that. So emotion regulation is really about our ability to choose our emotions to an extent in order to shape how we feel. So it might be about eliciting positive emotions, which again, as I noted, help to subdue or quiet those negative emotions. But it might be about what we can do to diminish negative emotions or even to avoid them, right? And there are different strategies I talk about in the book that help to strengthen resilience, but that are also about regulating our emotions, as emotion regulation is a part of resilience. Let me give you a couple of examples. So distraction, for instance, is a strategy that we can use to shift our attention, shift our focus away from a negative situation, whether it's job loss or we've lost a major client or we're encountering a natural disaster or something of the likes of COVID-19. So it's about to shift our attention after the onset of a crisis. So it happens quite quickly thereafter, in order to just give ourselves a moment, like a little bit of a reprieve. So it tends to be effective when it's short term in orientation and when it's quite absorbing. What we're doing is quite absorbing. So for some, it could be baking or cooking or going for a run or playing an instrument. It's different for everyone in terms of what might occupy them. And again, it's just like a momentary shift to give you a pause, to give you a moment, a little bit of an energy boost to go back and then to process those negative emotions and manage that situation more clearly later on. So that's distraction. Positive reappraisal is another strategy, but an emotion regulation strategy that we don't necessarily use or that's not necessarily effective at the onset of a crisis, so immediately after, but once that situation has maybe calmed down a little bit, as are the emotions, the negative emotions that are attached with such. So we find that it's more effective a few weeks, a few months, or even a few years later. And it involves, so reappraisal tends to involve changing, shifting our evaluation of a situation. And maybe we made an initial evaluation of a situation like a crisis as being negative, but then we come back to it later and we might see, is there any value? Is there anything positive that I can take away from this? For instance, entrepreneurs, those I spoke with over the years, talked about being able to do that by comparing themselves and their situation in a crisis to other people, other business owners affected who are much worse off, or comparing their situation to other difficult moments in their lives of how they recovered from those, or even thinking about how they may have grown in a crisis personally and or professionally, or in terms of how they reflected on all the support that they received from their communities, from their employees, from their friends and family members, and so on. So that's positive reappraisal and distraction. And those are examples of strategies that we can use to adjust our internal environment. Those are internal emotion regulation strategies. So emotion regulation is all internal, but sometimes there are things we do to shift our, not just our thinking or our attention, but our external environment, like situation selection and modification. So those are examples of such, whereby we think about, we anticipate things we have coming up. So it could be a task we have to do, a difficult conversation we may have to have with an employee. Maybe we need to make people redundant in these times of difficulties. Maybe it's about a place or event that we might need to go to. And some of those things can be positive and some of them can be negative. Some of them can elicit positive emotions. Some of them we might rather avoid, but in some cases we can't. So we do things, we modify our environment in those instances. So we might have a difficult conversation. So we do something before or afterwards to bring ourselves back to a kind of resting state, to help us to process those concerns, those worries, anxieties that we might be experiencing. But on the flip side, if we let our emotions run loose, right, if we do the opposite of emotion regulation, then it can affect our decision making. And we know from research on cognitive biases, there's something known as affect infusion or mood infusion, whereby when we're dealing with a lot of uncertainty and ambiguity and time pressures, like entrepreneurs are often dealing with in general, but especially in a crisis, that how they feel can actually impact on their decision making and not necessarily for the better. So being cognizant of that, being self-aware, but also looking for strategies to help you manage those emotions and process the negative ones are quite important.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I've discovered in training in money mindset coaching and psychology of money, and also through experiences. And what I find is normal therapy cannot solve all this. So it's very good that we talk more about this type of psychology of money. And also, like many professionals, you go and deal with budgets and you don't understand where you're coming from with your own story of money. I loved when I found out that, for instance, Ken Honda, he wrote a book, Happy Money, and he identifies the different personalities psychologically around money. So it's very good if anyone does one of these exercises, because that's the basic starting point. And that's why I always start with this question, where you are coming from. Even what you were saying, no, they are looking back to stories they had surpassed or gone through their life, because that's what's giving us fuel to understand how we react and how we are.
Yeah.
So everything you were saying, like also the part of this psychology of money, but also regulating yourself. I'm glad now that we talk more about these things.
Yeah, I'm glad too. And you're so right, because I think sometimes our worst moments, we despair or we have the tendency to ruminate, right? Which is the opposite of distraction. We're just fixated on the problem, fixated on the negative emotions. And I think if we can be aware of that in the first instance and step back and find a way to regulate, it's very helpful, because I've spoken to a lot of people, a lot of entrepreneurs who have said, yes, this is terrible. And in fact, in some cases, businesses who have burnt down. Can you imagine anything worse than that? They were able to rebuild. And I think in part because they reflected on those kinds of stories. Yes, this is difficult. My wife has cancer and we have worked through that. Or I was the victim of a flood a few years back. People relate back to these stories and they see their own resilience. They see their own triumphs. And I think it's very motivating and reassuring to know that these difficult situations do happen, but we've had the tools in the past and we can rely on them again.
Yeah, that's the part of knowing yourself better and working before these things happen, that you've done the work when a crisis in your life happens. That, yeah, eventually that's what is this. Life is a game. It's one of the books that I read this summer. Florence Kovelshin, and she was already a coach, and nobody mentioned her in the 1920s in New York, like the new era way of thinking, and people would go to her apartment to get advice. And so she wrote one of her books is Life is a Game. And I feel it sometimes, no, it's okay, this is a game. How are we going to go about with all the challenges? And it reflects back to what you are saying, the resilience that you build in life, even if you don't imagine. If you are coming from, I'll give you an example. You are coming from corporate, which is stable and yeah, at some point stable in your life, and you want to go to entrepreneurship, you may want to reflect about all the skills that you had across your life and all the challenges you went through, to release a little bit this uncertainty and secure attachment that you get when you're having a paycheck. Yeah, that's some of the things I was thinking before. But before, yeah, we jump into something else, I wanted to go back to, what do you think, or you've seen the, I don't want to call them mistakes, because there are decisions that you take and you don't think it's going to be a mistake. You just took a decision, but that founders made through this financial stress in survival mode. Because when we enter in survival, sometimes, yeah, we don't take the best decisions unless you've been into these survival energies. What you were saying, some of this energy that is driven by the situation might be good, or might be like, yeah, not helping you.
Yeah, absolutely. So interestingly, I was talking about this with a friend of mine recently. His name is Ben Gillum, and he is the CEO and founder of a business called Third Way. It's a very successful SME in the design space. And he went through COVID, and as did so many businesses, and it was a difficult time. And he observed how other people in his industry were also reacting. And he was telling me about the fact that some business leaders who had been quite expansionist, let's say, in the past, when COVID occurred, that they just lost complete control, and they weren't able to make those hard financial decisions. As he put it, they buried their heads in the sand, and some of them failed as a result. And then there were others that were almost the opposite, over controlling, and they were cutting left and right. And I think I alluded to it earlier. They were diminishing their marketing spend. They were getting rid of business development. And in some cases, of course, getting rid of staff and contracting. And when they came out of it, they completely lost momentum and there wasn't a place to go. And some of those businesses are still struggling, still trying to recover. And some owner managers are still trying to recover psychologically, in addition, I would say. So I think, yeah, navigating maybe that balance between too much control and too little control is sometimes very difficult, and having to make those difficult decisions around staffing in particular. And he was telling me, for example, that some businesses in his sector were trying to keep staff in any way, shape, or form possible, even sometimes increasing their salaries when it was the last thing they should be doing, when they should have been cutting. And his view was that it's important to keep the business in mind, that the priority is really with the business as opposed to individuals, unfortunately. And sometimes you do have to make those really tough decisions. And in some cases, people were leaving anyway and going to other businesses that had made those drastic cuts, but had more capital as a result. So I think it's very difficult, isn't it, to know what's the right decision in those moments. And I think what I noticed, what I observed in speaking to people through different crises, is talking to other industry leaders. You trying to understand what other people are doing. It doesn't mean you should do this the same necessarily, but I think, yeah, it's making decisions, but also stepping back and thinking about how is this going to affect us over not just the next quarter, but the next year, and being future focused as well. So I think for people like Ben, having one eye on the future is always really important, but not necessarily easy to do when you feel like you're drowning.
There's a lot of noise and anxiety.
Yeah.
And so that would be like one of the, if you want, tips or recipes, like going from survival to growth mindset. Or what would you say could be like?
Yeah, and I think,
Same.
yes, yeah, I think, and I guess with some of that comes that self-awareness. I think in general, though, if I was to focus on the how do you move from survival to growth in terms of creating that growth mindset, I would say it is about, yes, it is about talking to other people, and it is about leaning into them and their expertise and not feeling like you can or should do it on your own. I think that's a big mistake that a lot of people make, and not trying to take it all on yourself, to delegate. So I think without that, you're stuck. You're not going to go anywhere, right? So it's not easy to do, once again, to relinquish that kind of control, especially for entrepreneurs who might feel like it's their baby and they know what to do, or they've been through difficult times in the past. And it's good to think about that, but each crisis might present something different at the same time.
Good.
Yeah.
So let's move to the future ahead. And yeah, if you think the challenges that the entrepreneurs see in I was going to say next decade, let's not, yeah, it's here. This decade is completely squeezed. It's a whole revolution in entrepreneurship and businesses. What would you say that are the challenges?
Yeah. So I think,
or the advantages?
yeah, we probably think about a lot of the same challenges if we were looking at specific ones like cybersecurity and AI, and how smaller businesses in particular are contending with that. And I know it's not just the larger businesses, like in the UK, Marks and Spencer's was a victim of that recently, but I know a number of smaller businesses that have fallen prey to scams and have lost a lot of money in the process as well. So I think smaller businesses learning more about cybersecurity is really essential, training their staff to become more aware, putting processes in place to protect data further. That's a big thing. But also, it makes me think about, and I talk about it in the book in the introduction as well, this idea, which comes from the World Economic Forum, this idea that there are so many crises now happening at the same time, right? So we face climate change in certain parts of the world, or many parts of the world. Natural disasters are ongoing. So flooding is a big issue constantly in the United Kingdom. In some parts of the world, it's fires or tornadoes, etc. And so there's that going on. And then there's warfare. Of course, there's cybersecurity, there's dwindling resources. We have all these things happening. And one thing is for certain, it's not going to stop, right? So I think it's inevitable that more crises are on the way and we have to learn to contend with such. But the World Economic Forum talks about that this idea of a polycrisis is coming and will be super impactful and will exceed the sum of any discrete, any independent crisis. And we need to be ready for it. So I think as part of that readiness, thinking about resilience more and thinking about what I talk about in the book in relation to resilience work is really critical. And maybe just before I get into that, to say that often in research, we think of resilience as a trait. When we look at individual level resilience, we think of it as something that's stable, that's something that's enduring, something that we're born with. So, in other words, that we do or don't possess, or we think of resilience as an outcome, as something we do or don't achieve. But we can also think about resilience as a process, right? As a skill, as something we develop, something we build over time, something we flex like a muscle. And in order to do, we need to carry out what I refer to as resilience work. So it's really about learning over time how we can adjust, what kinds of adjustments we can make to our internal environment, as I mentioned earlier. So our thinking and or our attention. So our attention in the form of distraction, for instance, or managing our ruminations, or adjusting our thinking by reframing situations in the form of positive reappraisal, but also it could involve expectation management. It could involve self-talk, right? How do we talk to ourselves about ourselves, or how do we talk to ourselves to others, right? So that's really important because positive self-talk is not just doing affirmations in the mirror. It's really not about that. It's about talking to ourselves and encouraging and in a constructive fashion. So we see a crisis, we see it as a challenge, and we even potentially look for the opportunities as opposed to seeing it as a threat. So it's about making these kinds of internal adjustments to our attention, to our thinking, but also making those external adjustments that I mentioned as well to our situation and or our resources. So in the latter case, it might be offsetting resource losses by optimizing our resources. It might be about building new resources. It might be about substituting our resources. And it might be even leaning into specific resources like our social networks. So I think it's about engaging more in resilience work, and that will really become more and more important as we prepare ourselves, as we become more crisis ready over the next little while.
Well, I cannot ask you the last question because you already replied. I was going to say, how would you connect hope? But this is, for me, is all the ingredients that you have into resilience are if you want, the tool for hope into the next decades. So it's about building ourselves with all these tools, going into the way we talk to ourselves. I work a lot myself on that, and that also in the coaching that I do. And it's not only about affirmation; it's catching yourself what you are saying. Most of the times, you can do a very nice affirmation in the morning, but in the second that you turn, you are thinking about your bank account or whatever bill is coming or whatever crisis is coming, and you feel it in your body. Then it's about the nervous system regulation that you were talking about. So what I see in your reply is a lot of hope in building that resilience muscle. And we can invite the audience to buy your book. So this is great to have you with the kick of your book. And where can they find you? How can they find you on your website? Please tell us.
Thank you. So people can find me through LinkedIn, and on LinkedIn I have some links to the book, so you can buy it on Amazon or from other book retailers. And I've also posted some videos that's based on some of the content from the book as well. But yes, again, it's called The Resilient Entrepreneur: From Crisis to Enlightenment. And I hope people enjoy it and find some utility in it. There's research, there's a lot of stories, and there's a number of exercises and tools that people can take away to develop their own resilient. So hopefully it's useful, and people can always let me know what they think in addition. So that would be
Lovely. So they can give you reviews.
absolutely.
And
They can give me
feedback.
reviews or connect with me on LinkedIn and let me know what they thought as
Yeah.
well.
So glad to have you. So
I'm so
thank
happy
you
to be
very much.
here. Thank
Yeah.
you.
And see you next time.
See you soon. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Ciao.
Ciao.